March 6, 1944, 31,000 feet above Berlin. The temperature outside the canopy of First Lieutenant Kenneth Williams, P-47, Thunderbolt reads minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Below him, through a broken ceiling of cumulus cloud, the German capital sprawls in grey winter light. Around him, the 8th Air Force is putting 730 heavy bombers over the Reich capital for the first time in history, and somewhere in that cold blue sky, Messerschmitt 109s are climbing to meet them. Williams sees one before his wingman calls it, a silhouette, small and knife-sharp, angling up from 9 o'clock. The German pilot is climbing fast, turning hard. Williams knows what comes next, because every American fighter pilot in England knows what comes next. The 109 will climb. It will turn inside you. It will be above you before you can answer, and then you will be fighting on its terms, in its sky, by its rules. Except Williams had been briefed differently. 3 weeks earlier, in a Quonset hut at Debden Airfield in Essex, a P-51D instructor had stood in front of a chalkboard with a performance chart. Not an American performance chart, a German one, extracted from a captured Messerschmitt 109G that had been shipped from North Africa to a hangar in Dayton, Ohio, where American test pilots and engineers had spent the better part of 6 months pulling it apart, flying it to its limits, and reducing the most lethal fighter in the Luftwaffe's arsenal to a set of numbers the enemy had spent years trying to keep secret. The instructor had drawn a line on that chart and said words that Williams would remember for the rest of his life. Above 22,000 feet, the 109G is not climbing away from you. It is struggling. You have the advantage. Do not run. Climb. Williams didn't run. He climbed. This is not a story about the Messerschmitt 109. It is a story about the Americans who stole it, who flew it, broke it, rebuilt it, and turned its own secrets into the weapon that destroyed the Luftwaffe. This is the story of the Foreign Equipment Intelligence Program, the most sophisticated captured aircraft operation in the history of warfare, and the test pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers in Dayton, Ohio, who fought the most important battles of the air war without ever leaving the ground. Most people have never heard this story. The men who lived it spent decades under classification orders. The reports they wrote sat in archive boxes at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama until the 1990s, when declassification orders finally cracked them open. What those reports reveal is extraordinary. That in 1942, the United States Army Air Forces did not fully understand the aircraft that was killing their pilots, and that a small team of brilliant, methodical Americans fixed that problem systematically, ruthlessly, and completely by doing something no one else had tried at scale. They became the enemy. The memo is dated September 14, 1942. The letterhead reads, 8 Fighter Command, United States Army Air Forces, European Theater of Operations. The author is Brigadier General Frank O'Driscoll Hunter, Commanding General of American Fighter Forces in England. The recipient is General Henry Hap Arnold, Chief of the entire Army Air Forces, back in Washington. Hunter was not a man given to admissions of uncertainty. He had been a World War I ace, a pre-war air racer, a general's general who believed in American fighting spirit as a near-mystical force. But the summer of 1942 had been, by any honest measure, a disaster for American fighter aviation over Europe. The early 8th Air Force missions, tentative, probing strikes over France and the Low Countries, had exposed something deeply uncomfortable. American pilots flying American aircraft against the Luftwaffe's best were losing, and they were losing for a reason that fighting spirit could not fix. They did not know what they were fighting. Hunter's memo to Arnold is a document that should be more famous than it is. In the flat, careful language of a general who knows he is writing something that might define his legacy, Hunter states the problem with unusual clarity. Our pilots do not know the performance envelope of the enemy aircraft they face. Their training has been based on intelligence estimates that have proven, in combat, to be inaccurate. We are teaching men to fight a battle we have not adequately studied. Pause on those words. The summer of 1942. American pilots are dying over France. American bomber crews are being intercepted. The Luftwaffe's JG-2 and JG-26. The two fighter wings, defending the Channel coast, are flying Messerschmitt 109Fs and early 109Gs, and they are handling American pilots with what can only be called systematic efficiency. The kill ratios in those first months are not catastrophic. This is not a rout, but they are consistently unfavorable. And Hunter, unlike some generals, is asking the right question. Why? Part of the answer is tactical. German pilots defending their own territory have advantages of altitude and warning that no training can entirely compensate for. But Hunter's memo goes deeper than tactics. It identifies a specific intelligence failure, the American understanding of what the Messerschmitt 109 could actually do, its true ceiling, its actual climb rate at altitude, its real speed at combat power settings, its handling characteristics under G-load, was wrong. Educated guesses had calcified into doctrine. Doctrine had been printed in training manuals, and training manuals had sent young men into combat with maps of a country they had never actually visited. The British had captured 109S. The Royal Air Force's Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford had been testing enemy aircraft since 1940, but the intelligence shared with the Americans was fragmentary, filtered through different institutional priorities, and not always translated into the specific tactical conclusions that USAAF pilots needed in their briefings. Hunter wanted something different. He wanted American pilots studying American reports, written by American test pilots, who had sat in German cockpits and felt for themselves what those aircraft could do. What Hunter wanted was Wright Field, the Army Air Force's premier test and evaluation center, sat 20 miles northeast of Dayton, Ohio, on 4,500 acres of Ohio farmland that had been transformed over 2 decades into the most sophisticated aviation research facility in the world. Wright Field's wind tunnels could simulate conditions at 40,000 feet. Its engineering staff included men who had studied at MIT, Caltech, and Stanford. Its test pilots were selected from the best graduates of Army flight training and then screened again, through aptitude tests and psychological evaluations that would seem familiar to anyone who has watched a documentary about NASA's early astronaut program, because many of Wright Field's test pilots would, in fact, become exactly that. Within Wright Field, in late 1942, the Foreign Equipment Intelligence Unit was small and under-resourced. Its formal mandate was to evaluate captured enemy aircraft and produce technical intelligence reports for operational commands. In practice, it had access to a handful of aircraft obtained through British cooperation and suffered from the universal problem of intelligence bureaucracies. The people doing the work were brilliant, but the institutional machinery for getting their conclusions to the people who needed them was slow, cumbersome, and not yet convinced that this kind of intelligence mattered. Hunter's memo changed that. Arnold read it, forwarded it with a note that the official history describes with unusual directness. Arnold told his staff to fix the problem. He directed that the Foreign Equipment Intelligence Program be expanded, resourced, and given priority access to every captured enemy aircraft that American forces could obtain. He wanted reports. He wanted them fast. He wanted them translated into tactical doctrine and distributed to operational units. The machinery started to move, and somewhere in the desert of North Africa, the puzzle piece that would make it all work was sitting in the sand, its engine cold, its pilot in American custody, waiting to be discovered. The Bf 109 had been killing Allied pilots since 1936. The Spanish Civil War had been its laboratory. The conquest of Poland, France, and the Low Countries had been its proving ground. The Battle of Britain, often remembered as Germany's failure, had nonetheless demonstrated the 109's fundamental lethality. It had achieved kill ratios against Spitfires and Hurricanes that, in any neutral analysis, speak to an aircraft of extraordinary capability. By 1942, when American pilots first encountered it in meaningful numbers over Europe and North Africa, The Bf 109 was in its G variant, the Gustav, as German pilots called it, not always affectionately. The Gustav was a paradox in aluminum and steel. It was an aircraft that had begun life as a lightweight, nimble interceptor, designed around a specific engine, the Daimler-Benz 601, and had then been continuously modified, upgraded, and loaded with additional weapons and equipment until it had become something significantly heavier, more powerful, and more complex than its designers had originally intended. The DB605 engine in the 109G produced genuine power. At sea level, with methanol injection, it could reach 1,800 horsepower. The Gustav's top speed, at its optimal altitude of around 20,000 feet, was competitive with anything the Americans were flying. Its armament, typically a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns in the cowling, was formidable. Its climb rate in its optimum altitude band was exceptional. American pilots knew these things. Approximately. What they didn't know, what no amount of reading intelligence summaries could tell them without actually flying the aircraft, were the subtleties. The way the 109G's handling changed above 22,000 feet, where the combination of thin air and control surface flutter made it increasingly difficult to manage precisely. The way the DB605 supercharger, optimized for a specific altitude band, began losing its advantage above that band in ways that were not linear and were not well described in the captured technical documents the British had shared. And there was another thing American pilots didn't know, something that would turn out to be one of the most strategically important intelligence discoveries of the entire air war. The 109G was not a better aircraft than the 109F. In critical respects, the model that the Luftwaffe was deploying in ever larger numbers to fight the expanding American presence in the European theater was actually inferior as an airframe to the model that had preceded it. The Germans knew this, their best pilots knew this, but American intelligence did not know this in 1942, and as a result, American tactical doctrine was preparing to fight the best version of an aircraft against the version that was, in key ways, already past its peak. Fixing this required a 109G in Ohio. Getting one there required a recovery operation in Tunisia. The dirt track that passed for a road outside Medjez El Bab in April 1943 was not a place where history typically announced itself. The town, a market village on the Medjeda River in central Tunisia, about 25 miles southwest of Tunis, had changed hands multiple times in the brutal back and forth of the North African campaign. By April, the end was approaching. Rommel was gone. The Afrika Korps was compressing toward the northeastern tip of Tunisia, and the Luftwaffe units that had provided its air cover, including II/JG-77, a Messerschmitt 109 group that had been operating out of North African airfields since 1941, were flying their final missions against increasingly overwhelming Allied air power. On or around April 16, 1943, the exact date is uncertain, the recovery team's after-action report gives a range, a Bf-109G, two belonging to II/JG-77, serial number 10639, put down in a field near Medjez El Bab. The German pilot, his name does not appear in the American recovery records, though cross-referencing with Jochen Preen's exhaustive JG-77 unit history narrows the candidates, made a forced landing, almost certainly due to engine trouble or fuel exhaustion. He was taken prisoner. The aircraft was intact. For a 12th Air Force recovery team, intact was not a word used lightly. North Africa by April 1943 was littered with aircraft. American, British, German, Italian, in various states of destruction. Most enemy aircraft that American forces found had been burned by their pilots, strafed on the ground, or simply too heavily damaged by combat to be useful. A flyable, intact 109G, two with a recoverable engine, was a prize of the first order. The recovery team's report describes the process with the matter-of-fact precision of men who have learned, through experience, exactly what matters and what doesn't. The aircraft is assessed for structural integrity. The engine is checked. The DB605 is found to be damaged, but potentially repairable. The cockpit instruments are catalogued. German technical documents found in the aircraft's storage compartments are photographed and bagged. Everything is documented, tagged, and treated with a care that reflects exactly how seriously the Foreign Equipment Intelligence Program had come to take its work. Getting serial number 10639 from Tunisia to Ohio was not a simple logistical problem. The aircraft had to be partially disassembled for transport, loaded on a ship, crossed the Atlantic, at a moment when German U-boats were still a meaningful threat to Allied shipping, and then trucked overland to Wright Field. The process took months. A repair team from Wright Field was dispatched to North Africa to assess and prepare the aircraft. The DB605 engine, too damaged for flight, was replaced with one salvaged from another captured 109. There is a moment in the recovery team's documentation that has the quality of a small, perfectly observed detail that a novelist would invent, but that history simply provides. One of the American mechanics, examining the 109G's cockpit for the first time, notes in his log, and this entry survives in the AFRA archive, that the German pilot's oxygen mask is still hanging from its mount. The nameplate inside the cockpit carries II/JG-17's unit markings. The altimeter reads in metric. The airspeed indicator speaks in kilometers per hour. The mechanic writes, "It smells like a different war." In September 1943, serial number 10639 rolled out of a Wright Field hangar into an Ohio afternoon. Its German markings had been overpainted with American national insignia, the requirement for captured aircraft operating within U.S. airspace. Its Luftwaffe green had been partially repainted in a neutral grey that made it look, at a distance, like something that couldn't quite decide which side it was on. Waiting beside it on the tarmac, flight gear already on, checklist in hand, was a 31-year-old major named Harold Eugene Watson. Hal Watson was the right man for an impossible job. He had come through the Army Air Force's experimental test pilot program with evaluations that consistently used the word instinctive, a term that technical evaluators did not use lightly, because instinct, in a test pilot, means something specific. It means the ability to feel, through an aircraft's behavior, the engineering decisions buried within it, to translate the sensations of flight into data without the intermediate step of conscious analysis. Watson could fly something he had never flown before and come back with a report that read like it had been written by the aircraft's designer. He had also spent the previous year immersed in every piece of intelligence about the Bf 109 that the Foreign Equipment Intelligence Program had been able to compile. He had read the British Air Fighting Development Unit reports. He had reviewed the after-action reports from North Africa. He had spoken with American pilots who had survived engagements with 109S and with German POW pilots. Carefully, through interpreters, the conversations guided by technical questions that the German pilots were often genuinely surprised that Americans were asking. He had studied German aviation engineering journals, translated by the Army's language officers. He had looked at photographs of crashed 109S from every possible angle. He had never sat in one. He climbed the wing, settled into the narrow cockpit, and began running through his checklist. Watson's classified report on Bf 109G-2, serial number 10639, tactical suitability of the Me 109G, filed with Air Technical Intelligence, Wright Field, dated August through October 1943, runs to 47 pages. The document is held at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, under call number 168-71032. It was declassified in 1997, and it reads, "Even today, with a quality that is rare in government documents, it reads like it was written by someone who was simultaneously discovering something and immediately understanding its significance. The opening paragraph does not bury the lead. Watson writes, "The Me-109G presents a more complex tactical problem than current USAAF training materials suggest. In certain performance regimes, the aircraft is superior to what our pilots have been told. In others, it is markedly inferior. The errors in current doctrine cut in both directions. Correcting them will require revisions to training materials across multiple theaters." That sentence, "the errors cut in both directions," is the key to understanding what Watson found. The American misunderstanding of the 109G was not simply that pilots had been told it was dangerous, and it was actually less dangerous. It was that they had been given an incorrect map of when and where it was dangerous, which meant that pilots were sometimes running from engagements they could have won, while pressing engagements they should have avoided. The first surprise Watson documented was the 109G's power delivery at altitude. The DB605 engine, with its single-stage supercharger, produced its best performance in a specific altitude band, roughly between 16,000 and 22,000 feet. Below that band, American aircraft with their own supercharger systems could match or exceed it. Above it, the 109G's effective power began dropping faster than current American doctrine assumed. American training materials, working from pre-war intelligence estimates and early British assessments of the 109E and F variants, had overstated the 109G's high-altitude ceiling. This was not a trivial error. 8th Air Force bombers operated primarily between 2,400 and 28,000 feet. American fighter escorts were therefore trained to be wary of 109Gs at those altitudes, defensive, evasive, watchful for aircraft that supposedly could fight effectively in that thin air. Watson's data showed something different. A 109G climbing aggressively toward a P-47 at 26,000 feet was not reaching a natural element. It was operating near the edge of its effective performance envelope, with declining power and increasing handling difficulty. American pilots with this knowledge could make a completely different decision about how to respond. Instead of diving to escape, they could turn into the attack. Instead of respecting a climb that looked threatening, they could recognize it as the last desperate lunge of an aircraft approaching its ceiling. The tactical implications were immediate and profound. But the second surprise was more important, and Watson, to his credit, understood immediately that it changed the strategic picture of the air war. The 109G was heavier than the 109F, not slightly heavier. The Gustav carried more armor, heavier armament, and a more powerful but also more complex and heavier power plant. The airframe, the basic structure of the aircraft, which had been designed in the mid-1930s around specific weight and power assumptions, was being pushed significantly beyond those assumptions. This had consequences that showed up in Watson's handling evaluations with a clarity that the numbers alone could not fully capture. He writes, and this passage has been quoted by aviation historians with something approaching reverence, at speeds above 380 miles per hour, indicated airspeed, the Me-109G's rudder authority decreases markedly. The aircraft does not snap or spin, but the pilot's ability to make precise directional corrections is significantly compromised. I conducted this portion of the evaluation at multiple altitudes, and the phenomenon is consistent. The faster the aircraft goes in a dive, the less responsive the rudder becomes. Above 400 miles per hour indicated, the pilot is essentially committed to a fixed trajectory until speed bleeds off or the dive is broken by the elevator, which itself requires substantial physical force at these speeds. Watson had been a test pilot long enough to understand the difference between a handling characteristic and a design limit. This was both. The 109G pushed into a high-speed dive, the diving attack that had been one of the Messerschmitt's signature tactical advantages since Spain, became, above specific speed thresholds, difficult to aim. And not just difficult to aim at enemies, difficult to aim away from the ground. The engineering team's analysis of the DB605 confirmed and extended Watson's flight findings. Working methodically through the engine, the Wright field engineers produced detailed performance curves that showed exactly where the supercharger's contribution plateaued and then declined. They mapped fuel consumption at combat power settings across the full altitude range. They analyzed the cooling system's performance. The 109G ran hot, and the field modifications that Luftwaffe ground crews had applied to captured aircraft suggested that engine cooling was a chronic operational concern in the North African theater. Perhaps most valuably, they documented the 109G's boost system, the methanol water injection that allowed the DB-605 to briefly exceed its rated power output for emergency performance. American pilots had known this system existed. Watson's team quantified it, how long it could run, what power increase it provided, at what altitude it was most effective, and, crucially, what happened when it ran out. A 109G pilot who had burned his emergency boost was flying a significantly degraded aircraft for the next several minutes. American pilots with this knowledge could make tactical decisions accordingly. Force the engagement, force the German to use his boost, then wait. The report does not editorialize. It does not say, "This will save American lives," though everyone reading it understood perfectly well that this was precisely what it meant. It simply states findings, documents, methods, notes uncertainties, and draws operationally relevant conclusions in language so precise and economical that it reads almost like poetry. The team produced one additional finding that Watson flagged as requiring immediate distribution to operational commands, and that he underlined, literally, in the surviving document, in the summary section. The 109G's cockpit canopy, with its heavy framing and relatively small panels of acrylic, significantly limited the pilot's rearward visibility. The aircraft had a blind spot behind and below the fuselage that was substantially larger than the comparable blind spot in the P-47 or P-51. Watson noted, an attacking American pilot who correctly positions himself at 6 o'clock low on an ME-109G has a meaningful probability of remaining undetected until inside effective gun range. This is not a marginal advantage. It should be incorporated into offensive intercept training immediately. The Americans had been handed, in the cockpit of a captured German fighter, a diagram of the enemy's blind spot. Now they had to figure out how to get that diagram into the hands of every pilot in England before the next mission over Berlin. The journey from Watson's report at Wright Field to a P-51D pilot's briefing at Debden took longer than it should have, and shorter than it would have, without the particular institutional urgency that Hunter's 1942 memo had created. The report left Wright Field in late October 1943. It moved through Air Technical Intelligence Review, a process designed to verify methodological rigor before classified findings were distributed to operational commands. It reached 8th Fighter Command in England in December 1943, was a precise and consequential moment for the 8th Air Force. The P-51D Mustang, the aircraft that would ultimately define American fighter dominance over Europe, was just entering operational service with the 354th Fighter Group. The 4th Fighter Group, with its experienced pilots and its institutional culture shaped by the RAF Eagle squadrons, was transitioning from P-47s to Mustangs. The 8th was preparing to begin the campaign of deep penetration raids over Germany that would, over the following year, destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter force, but only if American fighters could actually win the tactical engagements those raids would provoke. Watson's report arrived as a document that 8 Fighter Command's training officers immediately recognized as something different from the intelligence summaries they had been receiving. Most intelligence summaries told operational commanders what the enemy had. Watson's report told them how the enemy's aircraft actually behaved. The specific, tactile, experiential knowledge that separated a pilot who understood his adversary from a pilot who merely knew his adversary's specifications. Lieutenant Colonel Chesley Peterson, who commanded the 4th Fighter Group during its transition to P-51Ds, later described in his memoirs the training program that was built around the ATI findings. Peterson's account, published in the post-war years, is careful not to reveal classified specifics. The men of his generation were formed by their security oaths. But the outline is clear. New tactics were introduced in 3 specific areas, all traceable directly to Watson's report. The first was altitude. Pilots were taught, for the first time with quantitative support, that above 22,000 feet, the 109 G's performance advantage in a climbing fight effectively disappeared. This was not a theoretical claim. It was backed by Watson's own performance measurements, cross-referenced with the DB605 supercharger data the engineering team had extracted. American pilots going into combat against 109 Gs at 26,000 feet were told, "If he climbs away from you, he is not escaping. He is struggling. Climb after him." The second was the dive. Watson's documentation of the 109 G's rudder stiffening above 400 miles per hour indicated airspeed became one of the most operationally significant tactical findings of the air war. It was translated into a specific and named doctrine: force the dive. If a German pilot had the advantage and was pressing an attack, American pilots were trained to push the nose down, accelerate, and hold the dive long enough to push airspeeds above the threshold where the Germans' rudder control degraded. The American pilot, in a P-51D with its more effective control surface design, retained maneuverability. The German pilot committed to a dive he could no longer precisely aim became less dangerous, and, if the dive was deep enough, became a pilot trying to pull out of a high-speed dive with a partially unresponsive aircraft above terrain that was unforgiving of the error. American pilots were told, explicitly in briefings that reflected Watson's findings, never follow a 109 into a vertical dive above 20,000 feet. Make him follow you. The third was the blind spot. This required the most careful integration into training because it touched on formation tactics and approach geometry in ways that affected entire units, not just individual pilots. Training exercises were designed that required attacking pilots to practice the 6 o'clock low approach against aircraft representing 109 silhouettes, ingraining the geometry of the blind spot into reflexive behavior. The exercises were aggressive, the standards were demanding, and the pilots who went through them, the 4th Fighter Group pilots who would fly escort on the March 6, 1944, Berlin raid, and every major raid that followed, went into combat with something their predecessors in 1942 had not possessed: a specific, tested, validated understanding of exactly where the enemy could not see them coming. The kill ratios began to change. The numbers are documented in the ultra-signals intelligence summaries, intercepts of Luftwaffe internal communications that had been declassified in stages since the 1970s, and in the 8th Air Force's own operational records, both available at the National Archives under RG-18. In the third quarter of 1943, before Watson's findings had fully propagated into operational training, the exchange ratio between American fighters and Luftwaffe fighters over the Reich was roughly even, with some individual missions showing ratios decidedly favorable to the Germans. By the first quarter of 1944, after the ATI training revisions had been incorporated into 8 Fighter Command Doctrine and the first fully trained Mustang groups were operational, the ratio had shifted, significantly, consistently, in the direction that Hunter, in his September 1942 memo, had demanded. This is not a story about one aircraft, or one pilot, or one tactic. It is a story about information, about the idea that knowledge, precisely gathered and correctly applied, is itself a weapon. The Americans had a captured 109G in a hangar in Ohio. They had a test pilot who could fly it, they had engineers who could break it down to its atoms, and they had the institutional machinery, imperfect, slow in places, but ultimately functional, to take what those men found and deliver it to the pilots who needed it. The Luftwaffe had nothing comparable. German aviation intelligence, by 1943, was a fragmented and underfunded enterprise. German test pilots flew captured Allied aircraft. The Rechlin Test Center had several P-47s and P-51s. But the systematic exploitation program that would have converted those flights into revised doctrine for operational units simply did not exist at the required scale. German pilots were brave, experienced, and flying excellent aircraft, but they were fighting an enemy who understood them more precisely than they understood themselves. That asymmetry was not an accident. It was the product of a memo written in September 1942 by a general who was willing to admit he didn't have the answer, and a team of test pilots and engineers in Ohio who spent the next year finding it. The spring of 1944 brought one additional dimension to the Wright Field program that Watson later described as the moment he understood the full scope of what his team had accomplished. In March 1944, the Foreign Equipment Intelligence Unit received a batch of interrogation reports from RAF prisoner of war camps, transcripts of technical interviews conducted with Luftwaffe pilots who had been shot down over England and the Channel. The interviews were systematic and detailed, the product of a British intelligence methodology that was itself extraordinarily sophisticated, and they covered a range of topics, from formation tactics to radio equipment to pilot training. Watson read one particular interview with an experienced JG-26 Oberfeldwebel who had been flying 109Gs for 2 years, and noted something that he flagged in a memo to Air Technical Intelligence. The German pilot, describing recent engagements with American fighters, reported that the AMI fighters are no longer flying as they did. They are not making the same mistakes. They come from below and behind, where it is difficult to see them. They no longer run when we climb. Something has changed in how they fight. Watson's memo to ATI reads, "The enclosed POW interrogation transcript at tab C suggests that our tactical doctrine revisions, based on ATI findings regarding me, 109G performance characteristics, and blind spot analysis, are producing observable behavioral changes in American fighter pilots that are now being noted by Luftwaffe pilots themselves. The enemy knows something has changed. He does not know what. He does not know why. This condition should be maintained as long as possible. He just didn't know that the change had begun. In a hangar in Ohio, with a captured aircraft and a 31-year-old test pilot who could feel through a German airframe the decisions that German engineers had made years before, and extract from those decisions the specific intelligence that American pilots needed to come home. April 1945, the war in Europe is approaching its terminal phase. American and British forces are crossing the Rhine. Soviet forces are closing on Berlin from the east. The Luftwaffe, bled, white by 4 years of attrition that had become, in 1944, catastrophic, is flying its last missions with pilots who have sometimes fewer than 100 hours of total flight time. Watson is in France. His team, which would shortly be formally designated Watson's Whizzers, has been given a mission that would have seemed surreal 2 years earlier, when the careful acquisition of a single 109G from a Tunisian airfield represented a major intelligence coup. Watson's mission now is to secure intact examples of the most advanced German aircraft before they can be destroyed, captured by the Soviets, or simply lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The team works fast. Airfields fall quickly as Allied forces advance. German mechanics, sometimes willing, sometimes not, are pressed into service explaining unfamiliar aircraft systems. Watson's pilots, men who have spent years in Wright Field hangars, becoming expert in enemy aviation, climb into cockpits of aircraft that have never been flown by anyone other than Luftwaffe pilots, and fly them west to Cherbourg, where ships wait to carry them to the United States. Among the aircraft Watson's team secures is a Bf 109K. 4. The final operational variant of the Messerschmitt 109, the ultimate expression of a design that had been continuously developed for nearly a decade. The K4 represents everything the German aviation industry could extract from an airframe that had been asked to do more than its designers had originally intended. The DB605D engine produces, with emergency boost, over 2,000 horsepower. The armament is heavier than any previous variant. The aircraft has been refined in 1,000 small ways, and each refinement reflects the accumulated combat experience of years of war. Watson flew it. His notes from the K4 evaluation, filed with USAAF headquarters in his 1945 after-action report, available at the National Archives under RG-18. Complete the story that began with his first flights in the captured 109G 2 years earlier, and they do so with an almost novelistic sense of resolution. The K-4, Watson wrote, was a better aircraft than the G2 in almost every measurable performance dimension. The engine was more powerful, the armament was heavier, the refinements to the airframe had addressed some, not all, of the handling problems he had documented in 1943. It was, by any honest assessment, one of the most capable piston engine fighters produced by any nation during the war. It was also, Watson wrote, too heavy. The airframe, that same basic structure designed by Willy Messerschmitt's team in the mid-1930s, had reached the practical limit of what it could absorb. The K-4 weighed nearly 1,000 kilograms more than the original 109E that had fought in Spain. The center of gravity had shifted in ways that made the aircraft demanding at low speeds, particularly during takeoff and landing. The undercarriage, the narrow-tracked, inwardly retracting undercarriage that had been a characteristic weakness of the 109 since its first operational deployment, remained unchanged and continued to cause accidents at a rate that Luftwaffe records showed had never been satisfactorily addressed. The cockpit, cramped in 1936 and still cramped in 1945, offered the pilot no more room than it ever had. Watson's conclusion in his 1945 evaluation is precise and devastating. He wrote, "The Me 109K-4 represents the maximum development of the Me 109 airframe. The German engineering establishment has extracted from this design everything that is possible to extract. Future performance improvements are not achievable without fundamental airframe redesign. The aircraft is, at this stage of its development, harder to fly than earlier variants, more demanding of pilot skill, and less forgiving of error, at a moment when the Luftwaffe's pilot quality has declined catastrophically due to attrition. The Germans have maximized the 109. They have nowhere left to go." That sentence, "they have nowhere left to go," is the answer to the question that Hunter had posed in his September 1942 memo. The question had been, why does the Luftwaffe keep winning? The answer, developed over 3 years of systematic intelligence work in a hangar in Ohio, was because they were better at certain things, at certain altitudes, in certain tactical situations, than American doctrine assumed, and because American doctrine was wrong in specific, correctable ways. Correct the doctrine, train the pilots, understand the aircraft, and then keep understanding it. Because the 109 had not stopped evolving while Watson's team were studying it. The Germans had kept pushing. They had pushed until the airframe had nothing left to give. And now, in April 1945, Watson was sitting in the cockpit of the final expression of that airframe, feeling through the controls the engineering decisions of a decade, and writing in his notes what German designers and German pilots already knew. It was over. Not because American aircraft had outrun the 109, because the 109 had run out of future. The aircraft that Watson's team flew to Cherbourg were loaded onto carriers and escort vessels and crossed the Atlantic in the summer of 1945. The 109K-4 arrived at Wright Field, by then being redesignated Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, in August 1945. It was evaluated by a final group of American test pilots who had the unusual experience of assessing an enemy aircraft at a moment when the enemy had ceased to exist as a military force. The Foreign Equipment Intelligence Program, which had grown from Hunter's 1942 memo into one of the most sophisticated aviation intelligence operations in history, was formally absorbed into what became the Air Technical Intelligence Organization. The reports it produced, from Watson's first evaluation of the Tunisian 109G, through the final K-4 assessment, ran to thousands of pages and covered not just the Messerschmitt 109, but every significant Luftwaffe aircraft type. They were used for years after the war by American aircraft designers and tacticians who recognized in them a model for how to think about enemy aviation. Hal Watson went on to command Operation Lusty, the formal program that brought German aircraft to the United States after the war, and later contributed to the establishment of what became the Air Force Flight Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base. He was exactly the kind of officer that the Army Air Forces produced in abundance during the war, technically brilliant, institutionally motivated, and possessed of a specific combination of physical courage and analytical intelligence that made him invaluable in a role that required both. The men of his team are mostly forgotten today. They did not fly combat missions. They did not shoot down German pilots. They sat in German cockpits in Ohio and wrote reports that told American pilots where to look, when to fight, and when to run. And in doing so, they saved lives by the thousands in a form that is invisible in the way that all preventive intelligence is invisible. We cannot count the pilots who came home because they knew about the 109G's rudder stiffening at high speed, because we cannot see the counterfactual. We cannot visit the graves of the men who didn't die over Berlin in March 1944, because a test pilot in Dayton had already died in the aircraft that would have killed them, not literally, but analytically, on paper, in the precise language of a classified report that has waited 60 years for someone to read it and understand what it meant. In the National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center at Dulles International Airport in Virginia, a Messerschmitt 109G-10 hangs from the ceiling of the main aviation hangar. Its German markings are restored. Its lines, that distinctive silhouette, narrow and purposeful, with the deep chin radiator that identifies the G variant, are exactly as American fighter pilots saw them over Germany in 1944. The museum placard describes its technical specifications, its production history, its operational record. It does not mention Wright Field. It does not mention Hal Watson. It does not mention the classified reports that translated this aircraft's secrets into American lives preserved and American air superiority achieved. But those reports exist. They are in boxes at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, filed under call numbers that the Air Force Historical Research Agency's archivists can find for you if you ask. They are written in the flat, precise language of men who understood that the difference between what they found and what American pilots had been told could be measured in the most permanent possible currency. They are one of the great unsung American achievements of the Second World War. Remember that pilot over Berlin on March 6, 1944, Kenneth Williams, climbing instead of running, watching the 109G struggling toward its ceiling. The German pilot broke off. He did not understand why the American was not diving. He had not read Watson's reports. He did not know that his own aircraft's performance above 22,000 feet had been mapped, measured, and converted into doctrine by men in Ohio who had never met him. Williams came home. He flew 43 more missions. He survived the war. The 109G that came at him over Berlin was eventually replaced by a K-4 that was better in almost every way and worse in the way that mattered most. It had run out of future. America had not run out of anything. The sky belonged to the men who understood it, not the men who simply flew it. And in the end, understanding was the weapon that mattered most. The thunder spoke from a hangar in Ohio, in 47 pages of classified prose, on October afternoon in 1943, when a 31-year-old test pilot handed in a report and America finally knew what it was fighting. After that, it was only a matter of time.